Today I want to talk about the 3 things you need to know as a commercial real estate investor. 1 is you need to understand cap rate. Number 2, you have to understand the concept of a triple net lease. And number 3, you have to understand what TIs are all about. TIs is short for tenant improvements. So let's start with cap rate, because it's probably the most complex concept for many people to get their heads around. And firstly, what does it mean? Well, the definition of cap rate is that it's short for the word capitalization rate, and it literally means the rate at which you capitalize the rental income to arrive at the capital value. So if you've got rental income of $100,000, and let's say for argument's sake that cap rates are 10%, then the value of the building will be $100,000 of rental income divided by a cap rate of 10% or 0.1, and you arrive at a value for that building of $1 million. A building with a rental income of $100,000, cap rates at 10%, will be worth $1 million. Another way of thinking of it is that when investors look at investing in commercial real estate, they basically want to know what kind of cash flow are they going to derive from it. And if the building has a cash flow of $100,000, then a commercial real estate investor in a market where cap rates are 10% will be willing to spend $1 million on that. Now, if rentals doubled to $200,000, that would mean that he'd be willing to spend $2 million on that building. And conversely, if instead of being 10% cap rates, we had a building with that same $100,000 initial rental income and cap rates were only 5%, an investor would only need to get a 5% return, and therefore he'd be willing to pay $2 million to buy that building. So where cap rates are 5% for $100,000 of income, investors are willing to spend $2 million, whereas if cap rates are 10%, then investors would only be willing to spend $1 million to get that $100,000 of income. And if it's a not so good area or town and cap rates were 20%, then an investor would only be willing to spend $500,000 to get that same $100,000 of rental income. So there you have it. I know it sounds so simple, but it takes a while to get your head around it, because what you really have to understand is that a cap rate really shows the multiple of a rental that investors are willing to spend to buy a property. Now, very often you'll hear agents and sellers say that they're selling this building for $1 million at a cap rate of 10%. And they're really using the word cap rate here to mean at a return. So they're saying it's got a return of 10%. The building's on the market at $1 million, and the return, the $100,000 of rental income, happens to be 10%. In that case, the return is 10%. And it's similar. I know that mathematically it's the same, but if you don't think of cap rates in terms of the multiple of rental income that an investor is willing to spend to buy that property, then you'll miss out on enormous opportunities. And the sort of opportunities I'm talking about are, if you can buy a property which has $100,000 of rental income, then at 10% cap rates, that building should be worth $1 million. Everyone agrees with that. And if you can figure out a way of increasing the revenue, if you swap out a mediocre tenant for a great tenant, or you have a grade C tenant and you turn them into a grade B tenant, or the property is grade B and you turn it into grade A by providing more car parks per square foot of rental space, and it's just a higher grade building with more facilities. If you can double that income from $100,000 to $200,000, then the building's value will have gone from $1 million to $2 million. Now, you can double this rental income if it's at all possible. I'm not saying you can always do it, but I always find ways of doing it. I'm fascinated that more people don't try and have some attempt at it. But if you do that 5 years into your ownership, then you'll increase the value from $1 million to $2 million in 5 years' time. But there's nothing to stop you doing it in year 1 or in month 1, or as I often try to do, there's nothing to stop you doing it between committing to buying a building and actually buying it. So if you commit to buying a building with $100,000 of rental income at a cap rate of 10%, and let's say the asking price and the contract price is $1 million, but before you take possession, before you even apply for the loan, you've managed to secure a better tenant or an additional tenant, or however you want to work it, such that your income is now $200,000, then on paper that building is worth $2 million, and most appraisers will acknowledge that. Now, I know banks have this clause where when it comes to funding a property, they have to take the lesser of the purchase price or the appraised value or the appraisal of it. And that in general is true. However, if you point out to them, but yes, Mr. Bank Manager, when I bought the building, I admit I'm only paying $1 million for it, but back then, even though it's only a few weeks ago, back then it only had $100,000 of rental income. Whereas now it's got $200,000 of rental income. So even by the rules of your own ultra-conservative property appraisers, the building's got to be worth $2 million. They will likely agree with you. Certainly it's worked for me, because at the end of the day, they've got to look reality in the face. So if you have the situation, 100,000 of rental income, 5% cap rates, well, let's say 10% cap rates, it's worth $1 million, and you can increase the rental income, then you can increase the value. And if banks will only lend you 50% of the new appraisal of $2 million, then bingo, that's the purchase price. That's the $1 million you need to take the property down. So that is the concept of cap rate. It's crucial to understand it. If you've followed along with this, then you probably understand more about cap rates than many people in the commercial real estate industry do, because as I've said, so many of them equate the expression cap rate with return or NOI or yield or return on investment. And it's not. They're fundamentally different. Now, just to give it some more perspective, in different parts of the country and in different parts of the world, cap rates will be different at any given time. For instance, New York generally is a very desirable place for companies to have head offices, and if you happen to be on Wall Street, that is probably the most desirable piece of real estate in the world. And it is therefore not surprising that cap rates there are the lowest. Cap rates can be as low as 2% or even 1.25%. And when you think about it, a cap rate of 10% makes that $100,000 worth $1 million. A cap rate of 1% would make that $100,000 of rental income worth $10 million. So a cap rate of 2%, you're talking about $5 million. Someone will spend $5 million to buy that $100,000 of rental income. Why would cap rates be that low? Why would they spend a ridiculous $5 million to buy only $100,000 of income? Well, there are multiple reasons. The subtle one is that if you have real estate on Wall Street, chances are it will always be tenanted. Your chances of a vacancy are extraordinarily low because it's such desirable real estate. At any time, someone will be wanting to rent that. But the other reason, and this goes beyond an explanation of cap rates, is that in general, where cap rates are low, you find that capital growth is high. And where cap rates are high, where you've got a 20% cap rate, where people will only spend $500,000 to buy that $100,000 of income, generally that's not as good a location as Wall Street in New York, and therefore capital growth won't be as high. So generally high cash flow, low capital growth, low cash flow, high capital growth. And conversely, if you take some podunk town somewhere where no one ever goes, there's no foot traffic there, there's no vehicular traffic, there's no reason why anyone would go there, and it's cold for 9 months of the year, and there are rattlesnakes and everything else, cap rates are likely to be extraordinarily high because the chances of there being capital growth there are very low. If there's a new European or Asian company that wants to set up shop in America, they're unlikely to go to this out-of-the-way place. They're more likely to go to Los Angeles or New York or one of the big cities. That's why big cities tend to get bigger. Anyway, that's sort of a very brief and preliminary discussion on cap rates. And the second topic I want to cover today is a triple net lease. It sounds very odd. It's triple net. Net of what? And what's the triple bit? Well, in general, when there is a situation with a landlord and a tenant, then we all know that rent is usually paid. Rent will be paid by the tenant to the landlord in order to enable the tenant to occupy that space, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial, whatever. But when it comes to real estate, there are also other things involved to keep that property functioning. One is that universally there are property taxes, and sometimes they might be called council rates or council taxes or property taxes or city taxes, but whatever it is, there are property taxes involved. And then generally there's insurance involved. There are all manners of insurance, of course. You've got insurance on the building so that if there's a catastrophic loss of the building through maybe an earthquake or a fire or a landslide or a mudslide, then the building is covered. And then you've got contents insurance, where if you have photocopy machines and computers and PABX systems, although they're falling by the wayside, then if they are lost through whatever insurable event may occur, then there's insurance for that. And there's personal liability insurance, where if one of your staff members slips on the floor, or someone who's not a staff member just comes wandering in looking for the neighboring property, but they slip, you have to have some kind of liability insurance for that. So there are all kinds of insurance, but let's talk initially about building insurance, the premiums or money you pay the insurance company to cover the building in case of catastrophic loss through some insurable event. The question arises, who pays that insurance premium? And when it comes to residential property, it's almost universally true that it's the landlord who pays that. In fact, the landlord pays the property tax, he pays the insurance, and at the end of the day, the landlord on a residential property tends to pay for the maintenance of that property. So there's a leak in the roof, the landlord pays. The faucet or the tap is leaking, the landlord pays to get that repaired. A window is broken, gets a bit nebulous here, who broke it? But generally, if it's, let's say it's through a thunderclap, then the landlord will pay that on a residential property. But when it comes to commercial, the commercial lease stipulates different conditions and from residential. And usually, the conditions are that it shall be the tenant who pays either all of those items, the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, or if there are multiple tenants on the premises, they'll pay a pro rata share, usually based on their area occupied. So if there are two tenants occupying 50% each, then they'll each pay 50% of the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. If there are two tenants, one occupies 40%, one occupies 60%, then obviously it's split in that ratio. And if there are 13 tenants, all with oddball numbers and fractions of percentages of area occupied, then that's the number that will be used. But what that means is that the rent collected by the landlord is net of those other items, because the tenants pay for those other items in addition to paying the base rent. So in other words, the rent is a triple net rent, or the lease is referred to as a triple net lease. It means that in addition to paying for the base rent, the tenant will also pay monies corresponding to their portion, it might be 100% or less, of the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. And this is sort of standard. This is accepted by the industry. The occupant of the commercial space just wants to operate their business there, and they know that they have the choice usually of buying their own building and operating their factory or their hotel or their assisted living facility or whatever it is in that property. And if they did, not only would they have the capital outlay of buying the building, but they'd still have to pay the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Or they can lease from you, and then they pay a rental so that they don't have to expend the capital to buy the property, but they also pay the operating expenses. They also expect to pay the electricity and the gas used and the telephone facilities used. So for them, it's no big deal that they have to pay the ongoing services to the city. For trash collection and water services, often that's included in property taxes, or it's just, or the water might be additional, but you get all these expenses that are part of the operating cost of the building. And that is what the tenant is happy to pay, unlike with a residential property. I say happy to pay, I wouldn't say they're ecstatic, they wouldn't have a party about the fact that they're paying it, but they know that it is a valid cost of doing business, and if they don't want to buy the building, then they're going to rent and they're going to pay those operational expenses anyway. So they're happy in the sense that they know that if they wouldn't be paying you as landlord, they'd be paying another landlord. So the concept of a triple net lease is important to understand. Usually, if it's not triple net, if the landlord pays for those items, or the tenant might pay a share of them or something, it's usually called a gross modified lease. How they come up with these terms, I'm not quite sure, but there it is, that's what it's called. And if you understand this, and especially if you buy real estate, commercial real estate, that has triple net leases in place, or if you buy commercial real estate that might have gross modified leases, but at the next rent review, or certainly if the tenant goes away and then you have a vacancy for a month or two, and then you attract a new tenant, there's nothing to stop you putting the new tenant on a triple net lease. And if slowly you convert all your commercial leases over to triple net leases, maybe by having a lower base rental, but that means that you won't be subject to the vagaries of property taxes or fluctuations in insurance premiums or fluctuations in maintenance costs, because ultimately they will be handed on. Now, to be sure, on most commercial buildings, the landlord is responsible for the exterior maintenance. So if there's a leak in the building, the roof springs a leak, then it's the landlord's responsibility to fix that. But generally, if it concerns internal things, it's the tenant's responsibility. One example I always give is that because a commercial lease says that a tenant shall maintain the premises in essentially the same condition as they were when the tenancy was started, save for normal wear and tear, that means that if a light bulb blows or a fluorescent tube blows or a lavatory gets blocked, the tenant knows that it's their responsibility to get them working again, because the light bulb and the fluorescent tube and the lavatory worked when they started the lease, and so they've got to maintain them in those conditions. And it just seems a very natural, normal thing to do. But it does mean that your returns are net, and it can increase your returns dramatically, apart from all the other advantages of commercial real estate over residential, which we're not going to go into today. But I think many of you are aware that not only are there many advantages of commercial real estate, but I'm a big proponent of commercial real estate, and I really encourage you to consider commercial real estate in your portfolio as opposed to just plodding along and buying more and more houses. Getting started in houses is good. Most of us cut our teeth on residential real estate. I certainly did. One of the big advantages of residential real estate is most people know what a residential property entails. If you go to look at a potential rental property and there's no roof, or there's no front door, or there's no kitchen, you'll know that there's something wrong with it. You'll even know what's wrong. You can identify it because almost all of us have lived in a house at some stage, and therefore we know that normally you'd expect there to be a roof and a front door and a kitchen and goodness knows what else. But when it comes to commercial real estate, because not everyone has ever occupied a commercial premise, and even if they have, it's tended to be a very specific premise. So, even if you've occupied and worked in a coffee shop, you don't know what a paint shop entails or what an aircraft hangar entails. So many people are less confident in looking at commercial real estate to know if they can determine whether there's something missing or wrong. Anyway, that covers our second point, which is what a triple net lease is. And then the third item I want to talk about, which is I think almost exclusively used with commercial real estate, is TIs. And as I said, TI stands for tenant improvements. And I guess it's short for saying improvements required or desired by the tenant to make the premises more suitable for their operation. So you've got a vacant warehouse and a tenant wants to move in there and put in a grocery store. They're going to need all kinds of racks put in for shelving, and then they're going to need a part of the building carved off for offices, and they're going to need cabling put in to operate all the POS terminals, you name it. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. And in general, who pays for TIs is dependent entirely on the state of the market. There might be a very great shortage of supply. In other words, it's very hard to get commercial real estate. And in that case, in general, the prospective tenant assumes and knows and is happy to pay for TIs because they want the premises. And if they don't take those premises agreeing to pay for TIs, then the three people lined up behind them will say, we'll take it, we'll pay for TIs. So that's when there's a very tight market. But on the other hand, if there's a surplus of commercial space available, if there are lots of potential warehouses that the tenant could move into, then they're in a much stronger bargaining position, as with anything else. And they'll be more inclined to say, you know what, we would like a 3-month rent holiday, or we would like 20% of our first year's rent to go towards TIs. The formula as to how it's calculated can be anything. They're wide and varied as to how it happens. I've suggested 2 already. It's either a rent holiday for a couple of months, or it's a percentage of the rent for the first year or the first 2 years. However it happens, it doesn't really matter, because the end result is that people end up wanting to have their TIs done. And depending on the state of the market, that will determine whether it's the landlord who ends up paying or the prospective tenant. It's just one of those things where it's like anything in life, where it's supply and demand, and it's just a matter of figuring out what the market is bearing, whether you can get your tenants to pay TIs. I've had it very often. I've worked with a number of interior decorating companies. They leased premises from me, and they had a specific list of what they wanted done. And their rental was going to be, it was a very small premise. It was only like $9,000 a year. And they came up with a list of what they wanted done. And I said, well, could we get costings on it? And it came to $54,000. And I said, that's longer than your proposed lease. So that even if I agree to this and you stay there for the entire duration of your lease, forget the fact that I have to, cover other expenses associated with it, but it wouldn't even cover the cost of making these improvements. And when I presented that to them, I think they were surprised because they'd never looked at it from that perspective. And then they said, well, what can we get if we make the improvements ourselves? Because we've got the teams and we've got access to cheap supplies or reduced cost supplies. They get discounts, you name it. And so we negotiated something. I think it was 4 months of not having to pay rent, which for me was a lot less in capital value than in spending all those things. And this way they could do it on their own time frame, to their own satisfaction, and all parties were happy. But it's just a matter of supply and demand and having a willingness to negotiate. If you throw your arms up in the air and say something like, do you think I'm a raving idiot? That's ridiculous. I'm never going to pay that money for it. Go away. Get your premises somewhere else. They probably will. But if you sit down and just reason with them and say, listen, that doesn't seem reasonable for the reasons I said. Even if you stick it out for the entire duration of the lease, it wouldn't cover the cost of making those improvements. Generally, they see the light. So I reiterate over and over again in just about every session I have with people, be it live or through videos or podcasts or you name it, I say, listen, your ability to communicate is going to be one of the biggest determinant factors in your success in any industry, let alone commercial real estate. It happens to also apply to commercial real estate because we're all subject to the vagaries of our perceptions of other people. And if they come across as bullies and mean and you name it, you can add any adjective you like there, then your inclination to want to work with them is going to go down. Remember one thing, and this perhaps is my closing thought, is that your tenants are not your adversaries. It's not you against them. It's not landlords against tenants. The way I see it is my tenants are my clients. I'm dependent on them for my business. In that sense, they are my business partners, and I'll treat them as business partners because indeed they are. And when they know that you're treating them that way, that doesn't mean to say that you cave into any whimsical thought they've come up with. I had a tenant who had the audacity this week, as I'm sitting here right now, to say, all of my income is going in towards paying the rent. And for that reason, I think you should reduce my rent. Well, we happen to be in an environment where rents are going up. And the rents on the two adjoining premises went up. They hadn't had a rent increase in, I think, 4 years, but they went up by 35%. So the two neighboring premises went up by 35%, and this tenant in the middle said, because all of my income is going to paying the rent, I think the rent should go down, and why won't you do that? And I said, well, I won't do that because it's a strong market right now. It's a rising market. And if you decide to leave, which you have every right to do, then I will easily find another tenant who's willing to pay 35% more than you're paying. Proof of that is that I just acquired 2 new tenants, one either side of you, who are doing just that. So why would I agree to reduce your rent? Anyway, supply and demand. And this tenant saw the light of that. And it's just a matter of being fair and being balanced. That old saying, it's true, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat people fairly. Some will take you for a ride. I've been taken for so many rides. Maybe that's the topic of another podcast. But I'd still rather have the memory of having people attempting to take me for a ride and failing, or they succeeded for a while until I saw the reality of what was happening, and then it stopped, than having to be a mean, misogynistic pig so that you can get your way against common sense. So just learn how to communicate, be fair, don't raise your voice, listen carefully, evaluate it, come up with a lucid answer. And by the way, if they've made a good point and there's no counter to it, so be it. Then maybe they've convinced you of something. Be willing to change. Otherwise, in 5 years' time, you'll be exactly the same person as you are now, except you'll be 5 years older. That's a bit of a sobering thought. Let's hope that we can all grow and learn new things. I hope you've learned something new about commercial real estate, in particular about the definition of a cap rate, what a triple net lease is, and also what TIs are. Look forward to seeing you again in the near future. And in the meantime, I want to wish you, as always, successful investing.